Welcome back to our journey through the corridors of time, dear friend. Before we begin tonight's exploration into what can only be described as the most audacious military stand in human history, I want to ask you for that small favor. If you find yourself drawn to these stories of courage, sacrifice, and the clash of civilizations, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these incredible tales to life and ensures that the lessons of the past continue to inspire future generations. Settle in comfortably tonight as we travel back over 2,500 years to witness a battle that would reshape the very foundation of Western civilization. Close your eyes and imagine yourself transported to the year 480 BC, to the shores of the Aegean Sea, where the ancient mountain pass of Thermopylae stands as the last barrier between Eastern despotism and Western freedom. This is the story of the Battle of Thermopylae, where on a sweltering August morning, King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 chosen warriors faced the greatest military force the world had ever assembled. Here, against impossible odds, a small band of Greek warriors would demonstrate that the human spirit, when forged in the fires of conviction, can stand against any tyranny. No matter how vast, no matter how seemingly insurmountable, the Persian Colossus. Our tale begins not in the windswept hills of Sparta, but in the opulent halls of Persepolis, where Xerxes I, the great king, the king of kings, ruler of the mightiest empire the world had ever known, nursed a wound that burned deeper than any sword cut. The wound was not to his flesh, but to his pride, the humiliating defeat his father Darius had suffered at Marathon 10 years earlier, when a handful of Athenian hoplites had shattered Persian invincibility on the plains of Attica. The Persian Empire in 480 BC was a colossus that bestrode the known world like no force before or since. Stretching from the sun-baked sands of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the fertile valleys of Babylon to the wild steppes of Scythia, it encompassed territories that would dwarf the Roman Empire at its zenith. This was an empire that counted its subjects not in thousands or millions, but in tens of millions: Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Medes, Lydians, Phoenicians, and countless other peoples who had bent the knee before Persian might. Xerxes himself was no mere mortal king, but a living god in the eyes of his subjects, the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the divine force that governed all creation. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of cosmic law. When he moved, the very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Yet this god-king had inherited a humiliation that demanded nothing less than the complete subjugation of the Greek city-states that had dared to defy his father's will. For 4 years, from 484 to 480 BC, the entire Persian Empire had been transformed into a vast military machine dedicated to a single purpose: the conquest of Greece. The preparations were on a scale that defied comprehension. Ancient sources describe engineering projects that seemed to mock the very laws of nature. A canal cut through the Athos Peninsula to spare the Persian fleet from the treacherous waters that had claimed Mardonius's ships years earlier, and a bridge of boats stretching across the Hellespont, binding Europe and Asia in a temporary embrace that would allow the Persian army to march from one continent to another. The army that Xerxes assembled was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Ancient historians, drunk on the magnitude of what they witnessed, recorded numbers that seemed to belong more to mythology than history. Herodotus, the father of history, claimed that Xerxes' army numbered over 2.5 million men, while the poet Simonides spoke of 4 million. Even the more conservative estimates of modern scholars place the Persian force at between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, a host so vast that it would drink rivers dry and darken the sky with its arrows. At the heart of this mighty army stood the Immortals, the elite guard of the Persian Empire. 10,000 strong and bearing a name that spoke to their seemingly supernatural nature. These were not ordinary soldiers, but the finest warriors the Persian Empire could produce, recruited from the noblest families and trained from childhood in the arts of war. They were called Immortals because their number never diminished. Whenever one fell in battle, was wounded, or died of disease, another immediately took his place, ensuring that the unit maintained its sacred strength of exactly 10,000 men. The Immortals were commanded by Hydarnes the Younger, a man whose very name would become synonymous with military excellence and strategic brilliance. These elite warriors wore elaborate robes and gold jewelry that marked them as the chosen of the great king, though such finery was reserved for ceremonial occasions. In battle, they were equipped with the finest weapons Persian craftsmanship could provide: wicker shields covered in leather, short spears, quivers filled with arrows, swords, and large daggers, and the deadly composite bow that could pierce armor at distances that made their enemies seem like helpless children. But the Persian army was far more than even these magnificent immortals. It was a polyglot force that represented the full diversity of the Persian Empire. Babylonian heavy infantry, with their distinctive bronze armor, Phoenician marines whose ships controlled the Mediterranean, Egyptian archers whose skills had been honed over millennia, Scythian horse archers who could shoot with deadly accuracy from the backs of their racing ponies, and Indian warriors who brought with them the most terrifying weapon of all, the Spartan forge. While Xerxes marshaled the might of the Eastern world, 1,000 miles away in the austere valleys of Laconia, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. Sparta was not an empire in the Persian sense. It was something far more dangerous, a warrior society that had turned the very process of human development into a weapon of war. The Spartan Agoge system was unlike anything else in the ancient world, a brutal 23-year program that transformed ordinary boys into living weapons. Beginning at age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and thrust into a world where survival itself was a test of worthiness. They were organized into herds, placed under the supervision of older boys, and subjected to a regimen that would have broken the spirit of lesser men. The boys were deliberately deprived of food, shelter, and comfort, forced to survive on their cunning and strength. They were taught to steal food, not because theft was admirable, but because a warrior must be able to survive behind enemy lines. If caught, they were brutally beaten, not for stealing but for being clumsy enough to get caught. They slept on beds of reeds gathered from the river, wore only a single cloak throughout the year, and marched barefoot to toughen their feet for the rigors of war. Physical training was relentless and comprehensive. The boys learned wrestling, boxing, javelin throwing, and discus throwing. They engaged in competitive games so violent that death was not uncommon. They were trained in the use of every weapon, the spear, the sword, the shield, until these instruments of war became extensions of their own bodies. But the Agoge was more than mere physical conditioning. It was a systematic destruction of individual identity, and its replacement with something far more powerful: absolute loyalty to the Spartan state. Boys learned to think of themselves not as individuals, but as components in a military machine whose only purpose was the defense of Sparta. They were taught that death in battle was not a tragedy, but the highest honor, that cowardice was worse than death, and that retreat was simply not an option. The final stage of the Agoge, from ages 20 to 30, transformed these hardened boys into the most feared warriors in the ancient world. They lived in communal barracks, shared their meals in military messes, and spent their days in constant training. They were forbidden to engage in trade or commerce. Their only profession was war. They were not allowed to marry until age 30, ensuring that their loyalty remained undivided. The result of this systematic brutalization was a military force that defied all conventional understanding of warfare. Spartan hoplites did not simply fight in battles. They became battle itself, living embodiments of organized violence who advanced into combat with the mechanical precision of fate itself. They were men who had been taught from childhood that honor was more valuable than life, that the state was more important than the individual, and that victory was the only acceptable outcome of any conflict. The Hot Gates, the geographic setting of our drama, was as crucial as the men who would fight there. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal pass that nature herself seemed to have designed as a battlefield. Located in central Greece, It was the only practical route for a large army traveling from northern Greece into the heart of the Greek world. The pass was flanked on one side by the towering cliffs of Mount Calydromon, and on the other by the treacherous waters of the Malian Gulf. In 480 BC, the pass was even narrower than it appears today. Modern geological studies suggest that the gap between the cliffs and the sea was no more than 15 meters wide at its narrowest point, barely enough space for a single wagon to pass through. This geographical choke point was what made Thermopylae so strategically valuable. Here, the vast numbers that gave the Persian army its overwhelming advantage became meaningless. In the narrow confines of the pass, the Persians could bring only a few hundred men to bear at any given time, while the Greeks could utilize the full strength of their disciplined phalanx formation. The phalanx was the supreme expression of Greek military thought, a formation that turned individual warriors into a single, unstoppable force. Each hoplite carried a hoplon, a round bronze shield approximately 3 feet in diameter, on his left arm. This shield protected not only the warrior himself, but also the right side of the man next to him, creating an interlocking wall of bronze that could withstand almost any frontal assault. Armed with spears 8 feet long and swords as backup weapons, the phalanx advanced in perfect unison, its front rank presenting a hedge of spear points that could impale any enemy foolish enough to approach. The psychological impact of the phalanx was as devastating as its physical effectiveness. The sight of hundreds of armored warriors advancing in perfect formation, their spears glinting in the sun and their shields locked together in an unbreakable wall, was enough to shatter the morale of most enemies before the first blow was struck. The rhythmic tramp of their feet, the clanking of their armor, and the forest of spear points created a spectacle that seemed more supernatural than human. The 300. Into this crucible of geography and politics stepped a man whose name would echo through the ages. Leonidas I, King of Sparta. Born around 540 BC, Leonidas was the product of the same Agoge system that had forged every Spartan warrior, but he was also something more, a king who understood that some battles are fought not for victory, but for immortality. The crisis that brought Leonidas to Thermopylae began with a diplomatic exchange that would have been comical if the stakes had not been so enormous. Xerxes, following the custom of his predecessors, sent heralds to the Greek city-states demanding earth and water as symbols of submission. Most of the northern Greek cities complied, but when the Persian ambassadors reached Sparta, they met with a response that perfectly encapsulated the Spartan spirit. The Spartans, following the example set by their ancestors years earlier, threw the Persian heralds into a well. When Xerxes himself sent a personal message to Leonidas demanding that the Spartans lay down their arms, the Spartan king's response was as laconic as it was defiant. "Molon Labe, come and take them." These 2 words, simple yet profound, encapsulated everything that the coming battle would represent. They were not merely a rejection of Persian demands, but a declaration that some values are worth dying for, that freedom is not a gift to be granted by kings, but a birthright to be defended by free men. The Greek response to the Persian threat was a masterpiece of strategic planning. While the main Greek fleet would engage the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium, a land force would be positioned at Thermopylae to block the Persian advance. The command of this crucial mission was given to Leonidas, partly because of his military skill, but also because of a religious technicality that would prove fateful. The timing of the Persian invasion coincided with several important Greek religious festivals, including the Olympic Games and the Carnia, a sacred festival in honor of Apollo the Chonu. Spartan law strictly forbade military campaigns during these religious observances, but there was an exception. If the very survival of Sparta was at stake, a king could lead a small force while the main army remained at home to honor the gods. This religious constraint meant that Leonidas could not take the full Spartan army to Thermopylae. Instead, he was limited to his personal guard, 300 men who had been selected not only for their martial prowess, but for a more somber qualification. They all had living sons to carry on their family lines. This selection criterion was based on the grim recognition that the mission to Thermopylae was likely to be a one-way journey. The 300 Spartans were not ordinary soldiers, but the elite of the elite, men who had survived the Agoge and then distinguished themselves in years of additional training and combat. They were supplemented by 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and contingents from various other Greek city-states, bringing the total Greek force to approximately 7,000 men. But it was the 300 Spartans who would provide the backbone of the defense, their reputation for never retreating serving as an inspiration to their allies. The march to destiny. The Persian army's march through northern Greece was a spectacle that defied imagination. Ancient sources describe a host so vast that it took 7 days and 7 nights to cross the Hellespont, a river of humanity that stretched across the landscape like a living carpet. The very earth seemed to groan under the weight of this multitude, and the sky was darkened by the clouds of dust raised by millions of marching feet. As the Persian army advanced, the psychological impact was as devastating as any military assault. Greek cities that had initially planned to resist opened their gates rather than face the wrath of such an overwhelming force. The sight of the Persian army was enough to convince many that resistance was not only futile but suicidal. But at Thermopylae, the Greeks prepared for a different kind of battle. Leonidas had arrived at the pass several days before the Persians, giving him time to survey the terrain and prepare his defenses. The Greeks rebuilt and reinforced an ancient wall that had been constructed across the narrowest part of the pass, creating a fortified position that would funnel the Persian attack into a killing zone. The Greek position was as strong as human engineering could make it. The wall blocked the only route through the pass, while the flanks were protected by the cliffs and the sea. Behind the wall, the Greeks had constructed a series of defensive positions where they could fall back if necessary. But Leonidas knew that his real strength lay not in fortifications, but in the iron discipline of his men. The first day of battle. When Xerxes first laid eyes on the Greek position, he must have been struck by the almost absurd disproportion between the forces. His army stretched back for miles, a sea of soldiers representing dozens of nations and cultures. Facing them across the narrow pass were fewer than 7,000 Greeks, looking almost insignificant in comparison to the Persian host. The Persian king's first response was to wait. Perhaps he hoped that the Greeks would come to their senses and withdraw when they saw the full magnitude of the force arrayed against them. For 4 days, the two armies faced each other across the pass, the tension building like a gathering storm. During this time, Xerxes sent ambassadors to the Greek camp, offering rich rewards for submission and promising dire consequences for continued resistance. Leonidas's response was characteristic of Spartan diplomatic style. When the Persian ambassador warned that the Persian arrows would be so numerous that they would blot out the sun, the Spartan warrior Xerxes replied with typical laconic wit, "Then we shall fight in the shade." This exchange, whether historical or legendary, perfectly captured the Spartan attitude toward the overwhelming odds they faced. The battle began on the morning of the 5th day, when Xerxes finally lost patience with the Greek defiance. The Persian attack was launched with the confidence of a force that had crushed every enemy it had faced. Wave after wave of Persian infantry charged toward the Greek position, their war cries echoing off the cliffs as they rushed toward what they believed would be easy victory. But the Greeks had turned the narrow pass into a death trap. The Persian advantage in numbers became meaningless when they could only approach the Greek position a few men at a time. The disciplined phalanx formation, with its interlocking shields and bristling spears, proved to be an impenetrable barrier that the disorganized Persian assault could not breach. The first Persian attack was led by the Medes, soldiers who had a reputation for ferocity, but lacked the discipline of professional troops. They rushed forward with wild courage, only to be broken against the Greek spear wall like waves against a rock. The narrow confines of the pass worked entirely in the Greeks' favor, allowing them to concentrate their defensive power while preventing the Persians from using their superior numbers. The slaughter was horrific. Persian soldiers were impaled on Greek spears, crushed by the weight of their own advancing comrades, or cut down by the bronze swords of the hoplites. The pass became a charnel house where the dead were piled so high that the living had to climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the Greek line. When the Medes finally broke and fled, Xerxes sent in his second wave. The Scythians, another of the many peoples who served in the Persian army. But the result was the same. The Greek phalanx, seasoned by the first assault, met the second with the same disciplined ferocity that had characterized the first. The Scythians, like the Medes before them, were broken and scattered, leaving the pass littered with their dead. The Immortals enter the battle. By midday, it was clear that conventional assault was not going to break the Greek position. The Persian army, despite its vast numbers, was being held at bay by a force less than 1/10 its size. The situation was not merely tactically frustrating, but politically dangerous. If word spread that the mighty Persian army had been stopped by a handful of Greeks, the psychological impact could undermine Persian authority throughout the empire. It was at this critical moment that Xerxes made the decision to commit his most elite troops. The Immortals, the pride of the Persian army, were ordered to advance and break the Greek resistance once and for all. These were not the wild tribesmen who had made the earlier assaults, but professional soldiers, the finest warriors the Persian Empire could produce. The Immortals advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. They were led by Immortals the Younger, a commander whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his personal courage. These were the men who had conquered nations, who had served as the personal guard of the King of Kings, who had never faced an enemy they could not defeat. But the Greeks were ready. Leonidas had recognized that the real test would come when the Persian elite troops were committed, and he had prepared his men accordingly. The 300 Spartans, veterans of countless battles, took their positions at the front of the phalanx. Behind them, the Thespians and other Greek allies formed up in their assigned positions, ready to support the Spartan assault. The clash between the Immortals and the Spartans was a meeting of two military systems that represented different approaches to warfare. The Immortals relied on individual skill, superior equipment, and the intimidating reputation of their unit. The Spartans, by contrast, depended on collective discipline, superior training, and a willingness to die rather than yield ground. The battle that ensued was unlike anything that had occurred earlier in the day. The Immortals were not wild barbarians who could be easily scattered, but disciplined soldiers who knew how to fight. They pressed forward with determination, their spears and arrows finding gaps in the Greek formation. For the first time since the battle began, the Greek line began to show signs of strain. But the Spartans had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. This was what the Agoge had been designed to produce, men who could function as a single organism in the face of overwhelming pressure. As the Immortals pressed forward, the Spartans gave ground slowly and grudgingly, maintaining their formation and striking back with deadly precision. The fighting was savage and personal. In the narrow confines of the pass, the battle became a series of individual duels waged between the finest warriors of two civilizations. Spartan bronze clashed against Persian steel. Greek discipline met Persian courage, and the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. Hour after hour, the battle raged without decisive result. The Immortals, for all their skill and courage, could not break the Greek formation. The Spartans, despite their superior training and motivation, could not drive back the Persian assault. The narrow pass became a grinding mill where men died by the hundreds, their blood soaking into the earth that would become sacred ground. As the sun began to set on the first day of battle, both sides were exhausted. The Immortals, bloodied and frustrated, finally withdrew to their camp. The Greeks, though battered and reduced in number, still held their position. The first day of the Battle of Thermopylae had ended in what could only be described as a tactical victory for the Greeks. The second day of battle began with the same grim determination that had characterized the first. Xerxes, now fully aware that he faced not frightened farmers but professional soldiers, ordered a renewed assault that would test the Greek defenses to their limits. The Persian attack on the second day was more sophisticated than the wild charges of the previous day. Having learned from their initial failures, the Persian commanders attempted to use archery to weaken the Greek position before launching their infantry assault. Clouds of arrows darkened the sky as Persian archers attempted to break the Greek formation from a distance. But the Greeks had prepared for this tactic. The famous Spartan saying about fighting in the shade proved to be more than mere bravado. The Greek hoplites, protected by their large bronze shields, weathered the arrow storm with minimal casualties. When the Persian archers exhausted their arrows, The Greeks emerged from behind their shields, their formation intact and their spirits unbroken. The infantry assault that followed was even more ferocious than the attacks of the first day. The Persians, desperate to break through before their logistical situation became untenable, threw everything they had at the Greek position. Wave after wave of soldiers charged toward the pass, only to be broken against the immovable Greek phalanx. The Spartans, fighting with the precision of a well-oiled machine, demonstrated why they were considered the finest soldiers in the Greek world. Every movement was calculated, every thrust deliberate. They fought not as individuals, but as a single entity, their shields locked together, their spears moving in perfect unison. The sight of their disciplined advance was enough to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. But the Greeks were not without their own casualties. The constant pressure of the Persian attacks was taking its toll on the defenders. Men fell to Persian arrows, were cut down by enemy swords, or collapsed from exhaustion. The Greek line, though still intact, was growing thinner with each passing hour. As the second day drew to a close, it became clear that the Greeks had won another tactical victory. The Persian army, despite its vast numbers and the courage of its soldiers, had been unable to break through the pass. The bodies of thousands of Persian soldiers littered the battlefield, while the Greek casualties, though significant, were far fewer. But Xerxes was not yet ready to admit defeat. As his frustrated commanders gathered to discuss their options, a solution to their problem was about to present itself from an unexpected source. The betrayal, the course of the battle, and perhaps the entire history of Western civilization, was about to change because of the actions of a single man whose name would become synonymous with treachery. Ephialtes of Trachis was a local Greek who possessed knowledge that would prove fatal to the Greek cause. He knew of a mountain path that could lead the Persian army around the Greek position. The Thermopylae path was a narrow mountain trail that wound through the hills behind Mount Calidramon. It was known to the local shepherds and hunters who used it to move their flocks and pursue game, but it was not the kind of route that would normally be considered suitable for military operations. The path was treacherous, winding through rocky terrain and dense forests, and it would require a skilled guide to navigate it safely in daylight, let alone at night. But Ephialtes saw in this obscure mountain trail an opportunity for personal gain. The Persian king had offered substantial rewards for information that would help him defeat the Greeks, and the knowledge of the Thermopylae path was exactly the kind of intelligence that could turn the tide of battle. Motivated by greed and perhaps resentment toward the Greek alliance that had largely ignored his hometown, Ephialtes made his way to the Persian camp. The meeting between Ephialtes and Xerxes was a moment that would echo through history. The Persian king, frustrated by 2 days of fruitless assaults, immediately recognized the value of the information he was being offered. If the path truly existed and could accommodate a military force, it would allow the Persians to outflank the Greek position and attack from behind. Xerxes assigned the mission to Hydarnes and his Immortals, the elite troops who had proven themselves in countless battles. The plan was elegantly simple. While the main Persian army continued its frontal assault on the Greek position, Hydarnes would lead his men along the mountain path during the night, emerging behind the Greek lines at dawn. Caught between two forces, the Greeks would be crushed. The Persian nighttime march along the Thermopylae path was a masterpiece of military execution. Hydarnes, guided by Ephialtes, led his 10,000 immortals through the treacherous mountain terrain in complete darkness. The march required precise timing and perfect discipline. Any mistake could result in the entire force becoming lost in the mountains, or, worse, stumbling into a ravine. The Greeks were not completely unprepared for the possibility of such a maneuver. Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain path to guard against exactly this kind of flanking movement. But the Phocians, perhaps overconfident in their defensive position or simply caught off guard by the skill of the Persian advance, were surprised and scattered by the Immortals' assault. As dawn broke on the third day of battle, Greek sentries on the mountain slopes saw the glint of Persian armor moving through the trees. The impossible had happened. The Persians had found a way around the Greek position. The trap that had held the Persian army for 2 days was about to be sprung, but this time it would be the Greeks who found themselves caught. The final day. The news of the Persian flanking movement reached Leonidas just as the third day's battle was beginning. The king of Sparta, veteran of countless battles and student of military history, immediately understood the implications. His small force was about to be caught between two Persian armies, and the position that had seemed impregnable was about to become a death trap. Lesser commanders might have panicked or attempted a desperate retreat, but Leonidas had been prepared for this moment since the day he had accepted the mission to Thermopylae. He had always known that the pass could be turned if the enemy found the mountain path, and he had planned accordingly. The moment had come to transform a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. Leonidas' decision in this critical moment revealed the true genius of the Spartan system. Rather than order a general retreat that might save some of his men but would leave the pass open to the Persian army, he chose to fight a delaying action that would give the rest of Greece time to prepare for the continued Persian advance. Most of the Greek allies were dismissed and ordered to retreat to fight another day, but Leonidas and his 300 Spartans would remain. The final stand was not a matter of suicidal bravery, but of calculated sacrifice. Every hour that Leonidas could hold the pass was an hour that the Greek fleet at Artemisium could continue its battle against the Persian navy. Every Persian soldier who died at Thermopylae was one less warrior who would march on Athens. The 300 Spartans understood that they were trading their lives for time, and they made that trade gladly. The Thespians, led by their general Demophilus, chose to remain with the Spartans rather than retreat. These 700 warriors, though not blessed with the military reputation of their Spartan allies, displayed the same courage and determination that had brought them to Thermopylae in the first place. They too understood that some things are more important than life itself. The 400 Thebans were forced to remain, possibly as hostages to ensure their city's continued cooperation with the Greek alliance. But when the final battle began, most of them fought with the same heroism as their Spartan and Thespian comrades, proving that courage is not the monopoly of any single people. As the sun rose on the final day of battle, the Persian army launched its most devastating assault yet. The main force attacked from the front, while Hydarnes and his immortals struck from behind. The Greeks, caught between two fires, fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were facing their last battle. The fighting was beyond savage. It was apocalyptic. The narrow pass became a cauldron of violence where men died by the hundreds, their blood mixing with the dust to create a crimson mud that would stain the earth for generations. The Greeks, though vastly outnumbered, fought with a ferocity that shocked even the veteran Persian soldiers. Leonidas himself led the final charge, his bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun as he struck down Persian warriors with the skill of a master craftsman. The king of Sparta had trained his entire life for this moment, and he met it with the calm precision that had characterized his entire approach to warfare. When he finally fell, pierced by Persian spears, his body was immediately surrounded by a protective ring of Spartan warriors who fought to the death to protect their fallen king. The battle continued even after Leonidas's death. The surviving Spartans, driven to a frenzy by the loss of their king, fought with supernatural fury. They withdrew to a small hill within the pass, where they made their final stand. Armed only with swords, and even their bare hands when their weapons broke, they continued to fight until the last man fell. The Persian victory at Thermopylae was complete, but it had come at a cost that would haunt Xerxes for the rest of his campaign. The 3 days of fighting had cost the Persian army an estimated 20,000 casualties, including many of their finest soldiers. The psychological impact was even greater. The news that a handful of Greeks had held off the entire Persian army for 3 days spread throughout the Greek world, inspiring resistance rather than submission. The aftermath and legacy. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Thermopylae seemed to confirm Persian invincibility. With the pass cleared, Xerxes' army poured into central Greece, capturing and burning Athens in what appeared to be the complete triumph of East over West. The Persian king must have believed that his victory at Thermopylae had broken the back of Greek resistance. But the sacrifice of the 300 Spartans had accomplished something that no military victory could have achieved. The story of their heroic stand spread throughout the Greek world like wildfire, transforming what should have been a demoralizing defeat into a rallying cry for continued resistance. The Greeks, inspired by the example of Leonidas and his warriors, found the courage to continue fighting against impossible odds. The true test of the Spartan sacrifice came just 2 months later at the Battle of Salamis, where the Greek fleet, inspired by the example of Thermopylae, destroyed the Persian navy in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The victory at Salamis was followed by the Battle of Plataea, where the Greek army, finally unified by the example of Spartan heroism, decisively defeated the Persian army and drove the invaders from Greek soil. The Battle of Thermopylae had demonstrated something that would shape the course of Western civilization, that free men, fighting for their homes and their principles, could stand against any tyranny, no matter how vast or seemingly invincible. The Spartan example showed that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The legacy of the 300 Spartans extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of their sacrifice. Their stand at Thermopylae became a symbol of resistance against oppression that would inspire warriors and freedom fighters for centuries to come. From the Roman senators who chose death rather than submit to Caesar, to the American colonists who declared their independence from Britain, to the modern soldiers who have fought against fascism and totalitarianism, the spirit of Thermopylae has continued to inspire those who believe that some things are worth dying for. The battle also established principles of military ethics that continue to influence warfare today. The Spartan code of never retreating, never surrendering, and never abandoning one's comrades became the foundation of military honor that still guides professional soldiers. The idea that a military force has a duty to sacrifice itself for the greater good when necessary became a cornerstone of military doctrine. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Thermopylae demonstrated that the course of history is not determined by the size of armies or the wealth of nations, but by the courage of individuals who are willing to stand for their principles. Leonidas and his 300 warriors showed that a small group of determined men, fighting for something they believe in, can change the world. The story of the 300 Spartans has been told and retold for over 2,500 years, inspiring countless works of literature, art, and cinema. But behind all the mythologizing and romanticization lies a simple truth. At a crucial moment in human history, when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance, 300 men chose to stand and fight rather than bow to tyranny. Their sacrifice ensured that the ideals of freedom, democracy, and individual dignity would survive to inspire future generations. The Battle of Thermopylae was more than just a military engagement. It was a defining moment in the struggle between freedom and oppression, between East and West, between the individual and the state. The 300 Spartans, in their final desperate stand, embodied the highest ideals of human courage and sacrifice. They showed that there are things more important than life itself, principles worth dying for, and causes that demand the ultimate sacrifice. Conclusion: the eternal flame. As we conclude our journey to the hot gates, we must remember that the Battle of Thermopylae was not ultimately about numbers or tactics or military technology. It was about the human spirit and its capacity to transcend the limitations of flesh and blood through the power of conviction and sacrifice. The 300 Spartans knew from the beginning that they were marching to their deaths. They faced the greatest military force the world had ever assembled with the calm certainty of men who had already made their peace with mortality. But they also knew that their sacrifice would mean something, that their deaths would serve a purpose greater than their individual lives. In our modern world, when we face challenges that seem overwhelming, when we confront forces that appear insurmountable, when we wonder whether individual action can make a difference in a complex and often hostile universe, we can draw inspiration from the example of Leonidas and his 300 warriors. They showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. That honor is not about winning, but about doing what is right. And that true victory sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. The hot gates of Thermopylae have long since changed. The sea has receded, the narrow pass has widened, and the landscape bears little resemblance to the battlefield where 300 Spartans made their final stand. But the spirit of Thermopylae endures. It lives in every person who chooses to stand against injustice, who refuses to bow to tyranny, who is willing to sacrifice personal comfort for principle. The Battle of Thermopylae reminds us that the greatest battles are not always won by the largest armies or the most sophisticated weapons. Sometimes the most important victories are achieved by small groups of determined individuals who are willing to pay the ultimate price for their beliefs. The 300 Spartans, in their moment of supreme sacrifice, achieved something that no military conquest could have accomplished. They proved that the human spirit, when properly directed, is the most powerful force in the universe. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the shores of the Aegean, where Spartan bronze met Persian steel in one of history's most significant battles. If you found this exploration of courage, sacrifice, and the struggle for freedom inspiring, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more adventures through the corridors of time. The spirit of the 300 Spartans continues to burn bright, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the greatest victory is not in conquering others, but in conquering ourselves. The warriors of Thermopylae have long since returned to dust, but their example lives on. In every act of courage, in every moment of sacrifice, in every stand against overwhelming odds, the spirit of the 300 Spartans marches on. They showed us that mortality is not weakness but strength, that death is not defeat but victory, and that the greatest immortality is not in living forever but in dying for something that will live forever. Molon Lab, come and take them. These words, spoken by a Spartan king over 2 millennia ago, continue to echo through the ages as a rallying cry for all who value freedom over submission, honor over life, and principle over expediency. The 300 Spartans of Thermopylae have achieved the only immortality that truly matters. They have become part of the eternal story of human courage and sacrifice.